I certainly don't want to be right about this. When I first sought out to, research your channel and you, I did so in an attempt to debunk it. Who is this guy? Talking about Grand Solar Minimum on YouTube? That's insane. How on earth am I learning about this on YouTube? Why isn't this on the news?
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying Grand Solar Minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the Grand Solar Minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne. Today, I'm going to be joined by Scott Chapman, who runs the website supergsminfo.com. Second Rangers from 2001 to 2005. And after working as a contractor in the Army, worked in the executive protection industry, provided security contracting in high-threat areas, government VIPs in Afghanistan. He's been in the Middle East. We're going to talk about security and the Grand Solar Minimum moving forward today. In today's program, we want to talk about safety. We want to talk about the human element side too, the story. We wanted to bring in a more personal level of preparation to the discussion. And how can you truly keep your family, your friends, and yourself safe during this time? And this is why Scott is joining me today. And Scott, I'll let you give your own introduction. That was mine, just the quickie out there in the beginning of the program so people could understand who you are and what we're going to talk about today. So please tell us a little bit about when you were serving with the Army Rangers and how that in turn helped you prepare for these changes that we're seeing in the intensifying Grand Solar Minimum, and how you were able to look at these society-changing events as a mission, not only for survival, but a mission to help others get informed and get prepared for the changes we're all going to experience together. And as we both spoke about, a more prepared populace is better for everyone. Because there's a huge opportunity at the moment, but we just need to get the message out, to hear it, and then to take action. And then this truly becomes a start point where we can prepare for these massive changes starting already. So Scott, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking your time to join me today.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm a big fan. I've been listening to you for a pretty long time, and I'm very excited to be here talking to you tonight.
You know, a lot of people are sitting on the fence. They either have heard a few things and rumblings about this. There's a lot of chatter across social media, people waking up saying, whoa, these weather extremes something's wrong. A lot of people looking for information right now, but you're taking it in a completely different track, which I was fascinated by. So continue on. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but.
No, sure. So I've been studying this stuff pretty intensely for a couple years. And I was interviewed recently on the Vinny Rock podcast, where I talk about in great detail really my journey of understanding to this whole process. Let me just jump backwards a little bit and kind of tell you how I developed this understanding. So I ended my contracting career in 2015, and then at that time I launched a small security company down in South Florida. It was an interesting business model where we provided vehicle roving patrol security for apartment communities. Physical security. So I had very high standards in employee selection. We grew very fast. We were pretty successful. So I found myself for about 2 of the 3 years that I owned the business. So I would do my daytime work. I would do sales calls and learn how to talk to people and sell my business. During the daytime and do all the daytime stuff. And at nighttime, I'd go out and patrol apartment communities. And I was constantly driving all night long. And I would drive for maybe 10, 11, 12 hours a night, conducting patrols all night long. So during that time, I've always been fascinated with science. So I would really dive into pretty heavy subjects. I would listen to lectures, really heavy lectures on deep subjects that I've always just wanted to learn more about, but I never had time. You're always distracted with something to do around the house, or you're going here or going there. I was a captive audience. So I sat in the car and drove with an earbud in, and, for hours and hours a night, digesting topics, like gravity and string theory, time dilation, theory of relativity, and just, studying all these theoretical physicists and just trying to understand their lectures. And I mean, I've been trying to teach myself calculus, but it's hard to do when you're driving a car.
And speaking of cycles, the fourth turning, what cycles of history tell us about America's next rendezvous with destiny? The fourth turning illuminates the past, explains the present, and reimagines the future. William Strauss and Neil Howe look back 500 years and uncover distinct patterns. Modern history moves in cycles, each one lasting about the length of a long human life, each comprised of 4 eras or turnings that last about 20 years and always arrive in the same order. First comes a high period of confident expansion as a new order takes root after the old has been swept away. Then comes the awakening, a spiritual exploration, rebellion against the now established order. Then the unraveling, with increasingly troubled eras where individualism trumps crumbling institutions. Last comes the crisis, the fourth turning, when society passes through a perilous gate in history occurring right now. Together, the four turnings comprise history's seasonal rhythms of growth, maturation, entropy, and rebirth. We sit at the next era of crisis based on the context of history's long rhythms. So the question is, how can all of us prepare individually and collectively for this great rendezvous with destiny? If you want to support this broadcast, click on the link in the description box to the fourth turning. What cycles of history tell us about America's next rendezvous with destiny? Available in both paperback and Kindle versions.
I think the years of trying to digest this heavy science, what it did was it gave me the right perspective. Because to truly understand what's happening to the sun, you need the right perspective. And we as human beings who only live 80 to 100 years, I mean, if you live 100 years, that's a big deal. But 100 years in the timeline of geology or the universe is insignificant. And we as a species are seemingly insignificant in the big scheme of things. So I studied some pretty heavy science topics. It was fun. I kind of ran out of things I wanted to study, and my wife's friend said, hey, you should check out this guy called Adapt 2030 on YouTube. I'm like, oh, what's that? I wrote it down on a notepad, and I couldn't wait to go to work that night and see what this channel was about because she was really excited about this guy, David DuByne. I'm like, okay, I'll check him out. So I listened to a bunch of your podcasts that night, and I thought, there's no way this could be true. What is this guy talking about? There's no way. So I figured, you know what, I'm smarter than this guy. There's no way. There's no way this could be true. Who is this fearmonger talking about the sun is going to go into a hibernation phase? That's insanity. So as I listened more and more and more, you started talking about a lot of the science that I had just recently come off of. You've started talking about a lot of these cataclysm events that I learned, through listening to Randall Carlson. You're talking my language. Like, whoa, this is interesting. So I jumped down the rabbit hole. All right, let me see who else is talking about this stuff. So I subscribed to all the channels and I listened to everything all the way from the beginning. So just like how someone can, binge watch a Netflix series, just how they can binge watch a TV show, for example, I would binge listen to all these channels. So I saw the bigger picture. I saw how the history was developing, throughout the course of a night. I was able to put myself in a position to connect the dots. I think a lot of these PhDs and researchers and people who are experts in their fields, well, that's mostly just it. They're compartmentalized. They're narrow focused in their research and narrow focused in their lectures. Whereas I had the ability to stand back far enough and put everything together into one lecture is essentially what I did. So I put together all the information under one roof. I've created a first of its kind. It's beginner's user guide. It's 3 years of research where I've condensed it down into a 2-hour lecture. It's a 70-page PowerPoint presentation where I explain everything from start to finish.
I could add a point in here. Yeah, Scott, let me jump in for a second. It is like that. It's very compartmentalized, because what I try to do is synthesize all these disconnected points across all these different disciplines because they're so disconnected. So the geology end of it's not really looking into the astrophysical side of it. I mean, there is some correlation, and there are some who do try to put that together. But when you take a look at somebody who's studying tree rings, they're not out there taking a look at morphology of our Earth. If they're looking at ocean raft debris sediments, they're not in connection generally with the pollen count people that are doing lake core drilling sediments, because it's such a specialized science that that's all they're doing is their own points to look at these proxies to try to reconstruct temperature or ice formation or ice declines over tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So there's very little communication I found within the entire scientific community. And it does take somebody with a wider field of view to just step back and say, hey, those two things connect right there. Hey, those two things connect right there too. And what I found most fascinating was a report, peer-reviewed research where they had done rainfall studies using stalactites in New South Wales and Australia. And they overlapped and found a correlation in Angkor in Cambodia that when there is a grand solar minimum, there's generally massive rains along the east coast of Australia, where some of the lakes that have been dry for hundreds and hundreds of years are 30 feet deep during grand solar minimums. And then what they found is up in Cambodia, it turns into a massive drought area. So it's an inverse relationship. They'd mapped this out over the last 7 grand solar minimums going back about 300 BC, and then they had some spotty information taking it back to about 2300 BC, if you will. So they go back almost 4,000 years. So they can come through these different cycles with the very solid information. And the way they correlated that is, again, it was just some researcher that was out there and said, hey, if we can find these 2 points where there's a drought in one area, why don't we just connect 2 points on the planet and during a grand solar minimum and see what happens to them. But what was interesting is they were trying to prove an inverse relationship by shifting jet streams and also the intertropical convergence zone, and that was their main study. But that is completely different. They didn't do any pollen count on the lake drill or on the lake drilling core sediments or anything like this. So it does take a wider view at points. I mean, the sea ice guys that are out there focused on sea ice, the glaciologists drilling for the cores to reconstruct temperature and look for volcanic eruptions over time, etc. They're a very specialized crew. They are not out there talking with the greater science community. It's all very, very, very compartmentalized, and it does take somebody just to step back and try to weave all these points together. So when you talked about Randall Carlson, again, how many different scientists did that take to come up and finally weave that together? There were so many disconnected points that they, just as independent researchers, put together that the science community did not, specifically with the crossing, galactic cross and all these types of things.
Yeah, sure. And one thing I like to say is that the information that I'm putting out isn't my own research. These aren't my thoughts and theories. Well, I have my own thoughts and theories, but I keep them to myself for now. But what I like to say is that I'm standing on the shoulders of geniuses. So the people who I study, well, these are PhDs, these are geologists, these are plasma physicists, these solar physicists. These are geniuses. So what I've been able to do, what you've been able to do, is communicate in a way that the people to our left and right can understand. Because these people who operate at this higher level of thinking, they don't have the ability to talk to the average people like you and I do. Whereas their intellectual peers, well, they can communicate back and forth, but who has time to read a 200-page science research paper or peer-reviewed paper? Who has time for that stuff, let alone understand it? You have to look up half the words that are on it. What I've done is I've condensed everything down into the easiest to understand format for my mom to understand. So hey, Mom, this is what I've been talking about for 3 years. I mean, I've created this with the sole purpose of letting the most important people in my life finally see what I've been talking about, what I've been screaming about for 3 years. I launched supergsminfo.com. I've received an overwhelming positive response, and a little alarming how on the mark I am with this information. A lot of positive feedback for this presentation. And John Casey talks about his wow moment in Dark Winter. And I can see it in people's faces. When I give this lecture, when I lay it all out, step by step by step, I can see the gears turning and I can see the wow moments in their faces. And it's like the light just turns on and they say, oh my God, I see exactly what you're saying now. it's a good feeling to know that I can explain this in a way, but it's also, you mentioned this in the intro, it's the human side of it, the weight of the message. I don't want to be right about this. I certainly don't want to be right about this. When I first sought out to, research your channel and you, I did so in an attempt to debunk it. Who is this guy? Talking about grand solar minimum on YouTube? That's insane. How on earth am I learning about this on YouTube? Why isn't this on the news?
TrueLeafMarket.com. I really want to talk about growing your own food, which will be a necessity moving forward. And there's so many ways that we can go about growing different types of vegetables that we're going to need. Microgreens are incredibly nutritious. They're super fast to grow. In less than a week, you can have something that you can eat. Also, sprouts. We can get those a little bit taller, a little more dense, a little bit larger volume on the vegetation mass coming off of there. So how do you know what kind of sprouts to grow? How about wheatgrass or herbs? What about different types of herbs that we can add to our foods? Now, what I just described to you, there's a full range of starter guides there at TrueLeafMarket.com for you to take a look at. Even if it's just for your own knowledge and you don't purchase something from them, at least get the information so you know how to grow microgreens, you know how to grow sprouts, you understand what some of the herbs are for. TrueLeafMarket.com. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds.
What I'm discovering is it is on the news. It's all over the news. But you just need to have the right perspective. You need to be able to stand back far enough in order to see the wide lens big picture. In order to do that, like Lee Wilbarger says, you need to understand 15 different sciences in order to truly have the right focus to see the big picture. And I call it's the monster on the horizon. It's right there, and it's coming up fast.
Yeah, and I could interject here for those of you out there. I know we have some new listeners today. Thank you for spending the time with us, because I know time is the most valuable commodity on the planet right now in terms of your everyday life and every day that we have moving forward into the grand solar minimum, but just life in general. So thank you so much for listening today and hearing us out to what we're talking about in preparations, etc. So my wow moment was as I was working as a coffee buyer in Myanmar. Used to go up into central Myanmar and buy coffee out of Pin O Luin. Now, as that was going on, the coffee farmers were talking about cold weather damage to the new tree plantings, which they had to overplant approximately 13% to account for the kill-off due to cold for the new plantings that would trim it back to the percent that they would want to put out. Because as a coffee buyer, if you're going to try to bring up your production levels for the next year and add on a certain amount of tonnage for export, they just can't magically find it. They're going to grow it for you, but they're not sure if you're going to really buy it. So you're going to have to prepay for those plantings out there and the labor to get that into the field. And that will be exclusively your plot, and that will be yours as long as you want to buy coffee from that plantation. And also what they were talking about was the top leaf damage to the mature plants, 3 years, 5 year, 7-year-old plants were really getting frosted on the top, where the top layer would have been so damaged that the leaves would turn brown, and then eventually they would just dry, and then they'd have to trim them off or flake them off. The bean density also, there was some changes in the bean density where these micro pockets of water would freeze in, and then after it thawed, it created small micro pockets throughout the bean. So the density of the bean has also been affected due to cold. Now, this is not exclusively in Myanmar, but it also occurred in Thailand and Laos, otherwise known as Laos, for most of you who read it on a map. So that whole regional area is definitely cooling on the planet. So if you're going to start pinpointing areas where things are cooling in the highlands, especially Vietnam, also that's another country you could check on a box that had real difficulty in coffee production with their Robusta, although Robusta grows at a lower altitude than the Arabica. So when you take into account these different kind of coffee production, after this happened, and I was like, wait a second, cold damage in Burma, that's what Myanmar used to be known as under the British rule, was Burma. We're getting cold damage in Myanmar. That's a tropical country. So I started to look for people who had information. I just simply was looking on the net because we were doing our supply forecast allocation. We were trying to look out 5 years and see if we could expand our production, because Myanmar at that time was just opening up and they weren't able to expand coffee production as much as in South America, Central America, different places. They were just still fledgling, and the farms were pretty much the same size they'd always been, but they were bringing on new production left, right, and center. But it takes a fair bit to get new tonnage out of a farm. So as I was looking for the reason that the cold damage happened, I ran into John Casey. But this is way before any of this was even hot. This is just as he was still editing what you talked about, Dark Winter. Cold Sun was the first one, and Dark Winter is the second version that he updated after. Cold Sun was the very first that he wrote. And when I contacted him, he was still in the editing phase of Cold Sun. So, we had a chance to chat back and forth, and that was my aha moment. Because once I saw his presentations, and they were very small, it was a very intimate crowd in Florida, and he was going around to different areas in Florida and regional community centers giving these presentations of about, 15, 20, maybe 40 people. But they were all the same thing. Not anybody spoke out because he used to be a NASA space advisor. He was a lead investigator for the Challenger explosion. And this is his credibility inside NASA. So when he presented all this information about the sun, there's nobody in the crowd heckling him or saying, "Oh, that's ridiculous. We got global warming." Or, and he explained the full science behind it. And once I understood that was my aha moment. And I realized that I had two choices in my life. I could go back to sleep and I could continue as it was, or I could face the fact and come out and start to live in a new reality that existed. So every time I saw news about global warming, this or that's warming, I was like, no, I can't believe that. I can't believe more people don't know about it. I need to start something. And luckily, one of my friends was doing YouTube and taught me how to do videos. And then I took it on my own, and now I have my own production company, and I'm starting up a new studio, moving into a new place. For those of you listening, I got a new apartment. It's going to be an urban garden. It's 20 feet by 60 feet, and it's on the 14th floor. And we're going to set that up with vertical grow towers, different types of beans, sprouts. We're going to do moringa out there, so I have a few people helping me, and it's going to be a full-on grow. Our objective for that urban garden balcony is to produce so much produce out of there that we're able to supply not only the guards downstairs who watch the building, but also the landlord and the restaurants that are in the local periphery enough to trade for food. See, we don't want to use money. We're already living in a different economy. That balcony is to create food, to trade for other value. And that's the way we're looking at it. So we can grow all of this, hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sprouts and vegetables per month, but we don't want to sell it. We want to trade it for value because we want to see where we can really take it and what people find as relevant value, because veggies and sprouts and things to use in restaurants are relatively cheap in the markets right now. But imagine if your food price triples, that will become much more valuable. But if you have the skill to start the bargaining that we don't want cash, we want trade, this is a whole nother way to think about it. And Scott, I'll let you continue with that.
You brought up a good point about proxy data when we were talking about compartmentalization. And a good example of that is when you learn about the Black Plague, Black Death, where there's really no records of the Black Death. What we know about the Black Death is the absence of information. That's truly what we are learning about what's happening to the sun. It's through proxy data where we can put it all together and assemble it and see the big picture. So you talk about food production in your apartment, and you talk about what one person is doing. And I think that's vital to understand that we're all in this together. No one's going to go in the woods for 6 months with a hunting rifle and get through this. We're going to talk about exactly what's happening to the sun later on, but understand that it's happened in the past and it's happened again, and our memory is too small. We don't have the right perspective to truly see what's happening to the sun. Do you want to talk about what's happening to the sun, David, or do you want to talk about more the human side first?
I wanted to continue with the human side, and the reason I wanted to throw that in the caveat, the reason I'm doing the urban garden on a balcony is I want to use it as a blueprint because I'm making the mistakes. I can speed up your learning curve. I can show you what worked, what didn't work, because I want it to be an open platform for others to be able to jump in and say, hey, did you try this? Why don't you try to grow this? And then compare notes. I want it to be an open platform. So I'm building out a new website to be able to put the information resources on here, do videos about it, do weekly updates, etc. But I do think that, no, we do remember. I'm going to kind of disagree on that point. We remember so much about these cataclysmic climate change and cataclysms in general that it's encoded in our DNA. People fear comets. They fear the heavens. And that is ingrained in our literal fight or flight senses. And I really believe that that's where the mass awakening is coming, because our internal DNA, if you will, of fight or flight danger response is suddenly kicking in and everybody's feeling on edge. And this is just something intuitively that keeps us alive. Like everybody is feeling something today. They can't pinpoint it to any causation, but everybody feels there's just something weird and strange and wrong going on, but I just can't put my finger on it. Like how many of you listening have that same feeling, or how many people have you talked to that have that same thought? Like, something's wrong, but I just can't put my finger on it. And this is, I think, what's turning on again is this DNA of fear of changes from the skies.
100% agree with that. People are starting to wake up and realize there's something wrong with the planet. There's weird things happening. There's extreme weather again and again and again, and people just are starting to wake up to it.
This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.